I'm Brian Mishara, Director of the Center for Research and Intervention on Suicide, Ethical Issues and End-of-Life Practices at the Université du Québec à Montréal, UQAM, and Professor of Psychology. And today we will be talking about whether there are some premature deaths we should not prevent, considerations when medical assistance in dying is an option, as it is in Canada and was first in Quebec. We all have some, okay, it's not continuing. It's not advancing my PowerPoint.
Je crois qu'il faut que tu cliques sur l'écran ici. Et là, ça va être, ouais.
Okay, sorry. Slight technical glitch has been solved. We all have an idea of what would be an optimal death, what is a good death for us. And many of us have fears about what that our death may be like. And it varies what people feel about should be a good death. But in general, in our society, when someone is dying, we react differently. In the 1970s, psychologist Bob Kastenbaum did some studies where he hired an actor to lie in a hospital bed and play being a patient who had some vague stomach pains. And they recruited volunteers, people who would participate in a study where they would be videotaped and they would visit people in the hospital. And for half the people, they were told that this actor had an ulcer and some sort of stomach problem, have to be there for a few weeks for treatments. And they were to visit them, and just a friendly visit. And for the other half, they said, this person has terminal cancer. The actor behaved the same no matter who came in, didn't know what they knew about him. And when you look at the videos, you can immediately tell when the person thinks the person was dying and when they think the person had no terminal illness. First of all, the people, when the person, they thought the person was dying, they stood a full meter away from the person, farther away. They almost always touched the person when the person was not dying. But if the person was dying, they very often didn't touch the person, or they just sort of touched them briefly and kept their body far apart. If the person who was dying, who they thought was dying, said, you know, I'm beginning to get some new gas and pains, they tended to say, oh, I'm sure it'll be all right. But when they thought the person was not terminally ill, they say, well, let's talk to the doctor. What are the pains like, and so forth. And then after a certain time, the researchers said to the people who thought the person was dying, you know, they made a mistake in the diagnosis. He's going to be fine. He'll be out of the hospital in a week or so. And the person they thought just had an ulcer or something, they said, well, we just discovered it isn't an ulcer. It's a stage 4 cancer. He doesn't have long to live. And what you see in the videos is the person who comes to visit the person who is now dying, who used to be fine. They used to come in and shake hands or give him a kiss on the cheek. They still did it, but they kept their body as far away as possible. And when the person who they thought was dying was not dying, they came closer and they spent more time touching them. So we have just some gut reactions to people when the word death occurs. And I contend that when you or I am the person who is dying, we still have those same aversions and those same concerns. So we all have our images of what death will be like and what may be the good death. And we deal with our fears of death in different ways. We do our best to avoid the onslaught of death. We are preoccupied in our culture by superheroes. And the main thing about all the superhero stories is it looks like they're going to die. I mean, they're doing impossible things, yet they survive, they surmount death. And that's one way of dealing with our fears about death and dying. So the issue in front of us, should we prevent all deaths or all suicides? And we live in a world where the zeitgeist has changed, our general philosophy of life has changed. It's a world where there aren't any real absolutes in the old sense, where we live in a time of secular humanism and some modern day versions of relativism, where everything depends. You know, you should always tell the truth, but you know, the majority of Americans can support a president who overtly appears to not be telling the truth. There isn't real absolutes. We talk about quasi-absolutes. Well, things that we need to do, but there are always exceptions. And there's a lot of fears that we have about death. I mentioned that we had an idea of what constitutes a good death. And if I asked you, you know, how do you want to die? You're going to die someday. Some people say they want to be surrounded by loved ones. Others want to die with their boots on and suddenly in the middle of work. Others in their sleep, they don't want to be conscious of it. But we live at a time where our images of death come from Hollywood or from our fantasies or our experiences with a member of our family. But death is much more hidden from sight. People now die in hospitals through almost all of history. People died at home. You saw them through the process. Specialists deal with death. Before it was the family. And the idea that someone should experience pain is not acceptable. We shouldn't have pain or suffering or discomfort or even unhappiness. The large number of people at funerals who take medications so they don't be feeling so horribly sad, as if it's not right to be sad when someone we love has died. And experiencing pain is certainly something that we want to avoid, and we're very good at it. We're very good at controlling pain now. But I think one of the most crucial things is that we don't want to lose our control, our autonomy, and our ability to decide for ourselves what we do in our lives. And so the idea, is that we have some idea, a notion of what it's going to be like when we die and what we will want. And some years ago, I did a study of people who had AIDS before effective treatments or more effective treatments were available. And during this time, we asked people, what are you going to want when it comes to the end, when you're going to be dying? And people varied in this. And we have these registered, we have these videotaped, And I could show you a video of a man who said, listen, when I'm a burden to others, when I'm not able to do the things that I enjoy doing with the life, I just don't want to continue to go on. And other people who said, well, look, it's up to God to take me when it's the time, no matter what happens to me, I would never do anything to end my life earlier. And one instance, that first person who said, I don't want to be a burden, had an agreement with his partner that when the time came, he was going to give him some little bit more of the medication so that he would end his life earlier. When we follow, what we did, we followed people up. We asked if there's someone we can contact if you are no longer reachable. And we tried to figure out what happened when people actually died. And there was no correlation with what people thought they would want. So that person who said, I don't want to be a burden, I just want to go, medications are available every day, his partner said, is today the day, because he was stuck in the bed, he was incontinent, he was having a tremendous discomfort. He did everything possible to live another second. And that other person who said it's up to God and was begging his doctor to please end my life. I think we're very poor at predicting how we'll behave in those circumstances. There's a lot of research on why people want to die. It varies depending upon what you're dying of. Often people with cancer, physical pain is a concern, but we're very good at controlling that in most cases. Usually when the pain is controlled, the desire to die is no longer present. When you talk about people, you look at people with physical handicaps, people who lost their legs or arms or important abilities, in general, they are less suicidal than people who do not have physical handicaps. They want to die less often. They enjoy living more than people who are in a full health and have no handicaps. And the other thing is that a lot of the treatments for terminal illness have a side effect of depression. So a lot of the cancer treatments, a high proportion of people will have an iatrogenic, an effect that's caused by what's given to help them of being depressed. And these depressions can often be treated. There are some exceptions. For example, there's some very high-risk groups. Hemodialysis patients are very high risk of suicide, for example. Now in Oregon, where assisted suicide has been practiced since 1998, you look at the reasons, and obviously they're not mutually exclusive. You can have more than one reason, but the number one reason, which over 90% of people give, is being less able to engage in activities, making life enjoyable, which is a far cry from what the laws have said that they're there to permit. They're there to permit people to, when you look at the laws legalizing euthanasia, assisted suicide, medical assisted in dying, to promote a more dignified, pain-free death. Yet loss of autonomy is the second reason. Loss of dignity, loss of control, bodily functions, being a burden to the family or others, inadequate pain control, and in the US, a small proportion for financial implications. I guess, it's difficult to determine what we're going to want in a situation we haven't yet experienced. And some countries have legalized it, giving advance directives. It's not legal at the present time in Canada, but that's something that the government, the current Trudeau government, is going to look at in the coming year. And advance directives is when you say, look, I don't want to die now, but if this sort of happens to me, I do not want to continue living. I suggest that we're not very good at predicting that. Usually advance directives, the majority of the cases of people have illnesses where they are going to have cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's disease, and they say, I just don't want to be kept alive in that circumstance. I mean, some of the implications of this are seem like they come from a science fiction story. In Belgium, there was a case of a man who made an advance directive and said, look, if I ever, he had the beginning symptoms of Alzheimer's, if I ever get to that state where I am no longer capable of recognizing my family and knowing where I am and what's going on, I just don't want to go on. Well, eventually he came to that state, and the doctor came in the room. He said, who are you? And I'm Dr. So-and-so, and started talking about advance directive. And the guy said, you came here to kill me. I don't want to die. I don't recognize anyone. I don't know who anyone is or where I am, but I don't want to die. Don't kill me. And the doctor said, I'm sorry, you're not legally competent to make a decision now. When you were legally competent, you made a decision, and it says that when you're in this state, that's it. And he said, no, don't kill me, don't kill me. He started screaming, and two members of the personnel held him down while the doctor gave him a lethal injection. It sounds ridiculous in a certain sense, and that's being discussed in the courts now. What do we do when we're in a situation, or we think of a situation where we haven't experienced it yet, but we have some fears about it? What we usually do and what we like is to keep all the options open. And I think we'll come back to that in a little while. David Weistub, law and ethics professor, and I have written a number of articles on the ethical premises underlying decisions concerning suicide and suicide prevention. And basically, we proposed that there are three broad categories of ethical approaches. Most people don't think about this. They don't say, this is my ethic, but it's implicit. And people we call moralists are people who believe that at all costs, you must save and prolong human life. You can be a moralist because of religious beliefs, but you can also be a moralist because you believe in some categorical imperative that somehow this is the way that humans must behave in order to have a just society, in a society that is equitable and works for all its members. So if you're a moralist, you will do anything you can to try to save a life under any circumstances. On the other extreme, you have people we can call libertarians. And an example of this is existential philosophers who said that basically one of the fundamental rights we all have and freedoms is to be able to end our life. Our life is ours. We can decide to live or not live, and suicide is a right. No one should try to intervene if a person decides they want to kill themselves. And the psychiatrist Thomas Szasz wrote articles saying we should abandon all suicide prevention. Suicide is a rational decision that people can make. And in between this is where most of us fall. Most of us are relativists. That is, we believe that in some circumstances we should do everything to save lives, but in other circumstances, less or not at all. And we can say it depends on the context. For example, if you're a 95-year-old man with terminal cancer who's feeling suicidal, maybe you can believe that we shouldn't try and prevent that suicide compared to a 16-year-old whose girlfriend just left him and is feeling suicidal. Or you could be a consequentialist. You can look at the consequences of your actions. These ethical premises have real implications for practice. For example, we published an article comparing suicide prevention practices in the United States, which is at one extreme. They're very interventionist, moralist, more so than Canada. Canada also is fairly interventionist. So if someone calls up and says, look, I took a bunch of pills and you believe that those pills it's a lethal combination, you say to the person, look, you need medical help, I'm going to send an ambulance. And the person says, no, I don't want an ambulance. I don't want you to trace this car. I don't want you to know where I am. I just want to talk to someone while I'm dying. They will do everything possible to get the person to say where they are and accept an ambulance. But if the person says no, they'll trace the call and send an ambulance. In the UK, Samaritans, which has major helplines everywhere within the UK and has a lot of support, it's very well known. They believe that life and the decision to live and die rests with the person who contacts them, the caller, a person who sends the text messages, and they will do everything possible to convince someone who's taken an overdose or is in a dangerous situation to accept that they send an ambulance and give their address. And they will stay with the person as long as they can, trying to convince them, and they almost always do, but sometimes they don't. But if not, they will not trace the call because they believe that an individual has a right to make that decision. So they have a more libertarian view. These are justified by a moral stance. Both the US and the UK organizations have a consequentialist argument too. The consequences of what they do have an impact on what is ethically correct according to this point of view. In the US, they say that people, even though they say, I don't want help, often call back and thank them afterwards. And people in the UK say, if we start tracing calls, people who are vulnerable and need our help will not call us, and we won't be able to prevent their needless deaths because they'd be afraid to call us because we're not really capable of assuring anonymity and confidentiality in all situations. So medical assistance in dying is expanding around the world, and almost always it starts with a more restricted group, and then over time, more and more groups of people and characteristics are accepted. So the extreme situation is in the Netherlands. There's a parliamentary bill that is proposed that people who are over age 65, even if they have no illness whatsoever, they're in perfect health, could have access to euthanasia, medical assistance in dying, for just because they say, I'm tired of living, I've lived enough, I want to die now. This did not pass. Just after the bill was proposed, the government changed, a more conservative government came in, and who knows if it'll pass in the future. We no longer talk about fears of slippery slope. Generally, you enlarge the process. You know, if you allow people who are suffering from physical illness to have access to medical assistance in dying, why not people with a mental illness? Can you say that someone suffers less if they have a mental illness? Can you cure all mental illnesses? The arguments tend to fall apart when they get tested in court, and we accept more and more groups of people. And this was indicated in September 11th, 2019, when the Quebec Superior Court decided that the restriction in the current Canadian law that death must be foreseeable without determining what exactly that means, but was not acceptable. It was against the Charter of Rights and Freedom. It was discriminatory against people who are suffering, who weren't terminally ill, for whom death was not reasonably foreseeable. And we're going to have to see now how the Trudeau government decides to react to that. And they just nominated a person who's going to form a committee and look at how the criteria need to be changed by parliamentary decision. But at the moment, basically anyone who meets the other criteria, which is basically suffering, have access to medical assistance in dying. And that includes someone with a mental illness, because people with a mental illness were not excluded from the law. It just said anyone who's suffering. But in practice, people with a mental illness didn't have access to MAiD because of this criteria that death had to be foreseeable, which was rarely the case. But now that that's thrown out, we'll see more instances of people with a mental illness requesting medical assistance in dying. Now, some organizations and individuals have said there's a big difference between medical assistance in dying and suicide. One of the most detailed descriptions was published by the American Association of Suicidology, where they listed the differences between MAiD and suicide. And almost all the differences they listed had to do with how it was practiced, but not the essential motivations of a person for wanting to die. And they didn't really deal with this issue of justifying some deaths more desirable than others. For example, they said, well, in the case of MAiD, you can be surrounded by your family, you usually are, but suicides, you're usually alone. Those are technical parts of the circumstance. The method of dying is different and so forth. But a difference in practice doesn't mean that there's different psychological dynamics or that the moral imperatives, how you need to deal with it, need to be different. There is no research indicating that people who request MAiD or who kill themselves are more or less depressed, have more or less mental health problems. And until the decision of Judge Baudouin, basically medical assistance in dying in Canada changed the timing and manner of a foreseeable death. The person was going to die anyway. It changed when they died and how they died. Now that that criteria of imminent death is no longer there, what that means is it's going to not just change the timing and how people die, but it will have as a result that people who wouldn't normally be dying in the foreseeable future would die. Their lives would end. Now, one of the things that's said repeatedly, without any research or empirical proof, is that in the case of MAiD, that's a rational decision, and in the case of suicide, it's somehow irrational, it's crazy, and there's a lot of ambivalence. People who are suicidal want to die and don't want to die. I contend that when we say rational, we're not saying that the person is more logical. What we really mean by it is it's understandable. When I think about it, I say to myself, if I was in that situation, I'd want to die. But when we look at rational decision making, you look at the other criteria for MAiD, you have to have suffering, mental or physical suffering, which cannot be treated as in many countries, not necessarily in Canada, we'll get to that, but you're suffering a lot. When people are suffering, that's not a time when we become more rational. There's research showing that when you're in pain, for example, you become much less rational. You just want it to end. You can't think straight. So the situation of being ill in and of itself, and particularly having a severe, debilitating, degenerative, or terminal illness, diminishes our ability to be rational. More important, I really don't believe that most important human decisions are rational decisions. What's the most important decision you made in your life? Who you married? Did you make a list of the person's qualities and good characteristics and all their defects and problems and make a rational decision? No. This was emotionally charged. I fell in love, and that was that, or whatever. When we buy a car, do we buy the most reliable, most frugal, cost-effective, safest car? No, we buy fast, beautiful-looking sports cars and big SUVs, and these are emotional decisions. They're not rational decisions. Why should we think that suddenly, when you're terminally ill and suffering, you're going to start behaving rationally? So this is an unrealistic expectation and criteria, and there are no data showing that there's any more or less rationality with medical assistance in dying and suicide. It's also often stated, without empirical proof, that the ambivalence that is omnipresent with suicide. I want to kill myself, but I want to live. And this sort of inner debate, should I do it? Should I not do it? Dying is difficult, but I'm suffering. So that sort of ambivalence is not present in the case of MAiD. You just decide, and that's that. Well, the state of Oregon this was the first American state to legalize assisted suicide. You're aware that in Canada, medical assistance in dying is the term used to describe two legal practices. One is when a doctor ends someone's life, and that's called euthanasia elsewhere. It used to be called euthanasia here. That's a form now called medical assistance in dying. And the second practice is what's called assisted suicide, and that is also legal in Canada, though it's rarely practiced. And that's when the doctor's assistance involves prescribing lethal medication, which a person can get at the pharmacy and then take themselves to end their own lives. Since the person takes this themselves, It can be considered a suicide, and the assistance is, medical assistance is the doctor giving the prescription. In Switzerland, this is practice where there are voluntary nonprofit organizations that get the medication handed to the person, then the person themselves must take it. So in Oregon, assisted suicide is legal. People must convince two doctors that they are suffering so much that they can't go on. And very few people do this. 1,500, almost 2,000 in the most recent years out of maybe 30,000 or more people who die each year. And of the people who convince two doctors they just can't go on anymore and they have to die, 36% fill the prescriptions, keep it, put it in the drawer in their pocket just in case they may need it, but they never take it. Which to me is an indication that this ambivalence exists even in the case of people who are, most of the people are terminally ill, suffer from cancer, but we like having this insurance. In case it gets too bad, I have it in my pocket. We have a right to make poor choices. We can smoke cigarettes despite all the warnings of the dangers. We can, marry whom we please, even if all our friends say this is a poor choice. We can refuse medical care. We really live at a time where autonomy is a major goal for many people, to make as many decisions to be able to do whatever we want. However, we still live in a society that protects vulnerable people and often protects us from ourselves, from making poor choices. For example, we have to wear seatbelts, whether we like it or not, for our own good. I have to wear a helmet when I ride my motorcycle. We can't go and just buy heroin in a store. There are things that society does to protect us from making poor choices. And what I am going to suggest a little later is that how medical assistance in dying is implemented is an important part of that obligation of society to protect people who are vulnerable and protect some people from potentially making poor decisions, even though a lot of people just want total autonomy. Just let me decide, I'll decide. People often confuse a hopeless physical prognosis with feeling hopeless. And there's a lot of research about that. There's research about building hope in hopeless situations. I've done some training and work with some people who have very difficult life circumstances, people working with refugees who are displaced and no hope of returning home, who feel suicidal. And it's relatively easy to build hope in those situations, even though someone outside observer would say it seems hopeless. And people who are terminally ill, and there's research from palliative care and hospice situations showing that even though the prognosis is hopeless, people on a day-to-day basis can be hopeful and often have a good quality of life. There's no empirical data to date indicating that there's any more hopelessness in people who suffer, who request medical assistance from dying, and people who die by suicide. And there is empirical support for the potential of interventions in suicide prevention, and by providing palliative care, increasing hope. And I wanted to just say a word about the Greek legend of Pandora and the jar. The jar? You thought it was a box. Well, I thought it was a box too, until I found out that in the 16th century, up until the 16th century, the story was about Pandora and the jar, and some painters liked painting a box better, putting a little lock on it or something. But anyway, the story is that Zeus sent Pandora down to Earth to marry, and he gave her this jar and said, whatever you do, don't open the jar. Don't look inside, don't open it. She was very curious, and she begged her husband to let her open it. And one day, she just opened it. And out flew all the troubles that humans have nowadays that didn't exist then. Sorrow, disease, vice, violence, greed, madness, old age, even death didn't exist. And they all came out to stay with humans for the rest of time. But what she didn't know, and what Zeus didn't know, was Prometheus added something to the jar. And he added to the jar hope, which also flew out, so that despite all of that, we could have hope. So, you know, I believe in respecting autonomy, but I also believe that if a life can be saved and hope can be increased, we should do it. And I don't think that respect for autonomy precludes active interventions in suicide prevention, whether or not someone wants to end their life by MAiD or not. And still respect the client's right to make final decisions. Now, there is a fundamental difference in the Canadian laws between Canadian laws and laws in other jurisdictions that have legalized medical assistance in dying. The first country to legalize it, the country where it's practiced the most, where it has the most acceptance by the population, is the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, they have an obligation that the doctor who receives the request may not grant the request at that time if she or he believes there is some treatment or intervention that will alleviate the person's suffering to the extent that the person wouldn't want to die, would want to continue living. And if that's the case, the doctor must inform the person and refuse having access to death as the treatment, saying, look, I think I've got a better treatment. Try that. And if it doesn't work, you can come back and see me again. And we'll talk about medical assistance in dying, which they call euthanasia or assisted suicide. And 46 to 50, depends on which studies, % of requests are refused, often because the doctor says there's some treatment. You know, you're feeling depressed as a side effect of your medication or because of the situation. Try some therapy or some antidepressants first and then see if you still want to die, or you're afraid of something that may not be realistic. For example, most people who are dying from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, one of their biggest fears is that they're going to die by suffocation. Research shows that less than 3%, 2% of people with ALS risk dying by suffocation, and doctors say that that can be totally avoided, that this is a big fear. So sometimes the fears may not be justified. So in Canada, the doctor has an obligation to inform the patient if there are treatments available, if he believes that there are things other than death that will alleviate the suffering, but he cannot refuse MAiD based on the fact that there's a treatment available. In Canada, the law states that the person who makes the request must decide for themselves if this treatment is acceptable to them. So we have the most liberal access to medical assistance in dying in the world now, with very little societal obligation to protect people for making poor decisions, for choosing death when there are other treatments available. So some conclusions. The main reasons people give for requesting MAiD are being less able to engage in activities that they find enjoyable, loss of autonomy, loss of dignity, of bodily functions, feeling a burden in family and friends. So there are a lot of, it's more how we're living during that period of experiencing the effects of an illness of some type. People who are suffering want to die, and if you alleviate the suffering, they generally don't want to die. This is true for physical pain as well as psychological suffering. And some feel that we have a moral obligation to do everything possible to alleviate suffering before having access to death. Human decision-making is not generally rational, at least for important decisions in life, and even less rational at the end of life. And when someone's suffering, very often all their rational thoughts or their fantasies go out the window. They just want the suffering to end. So if you really want someone to be able to make a rational, clear decision, you've got to alleviate the suffering first. Now that we no longer in Canada have the requirement that death be imminent, anyone who is suffering and from any type of problem or situation can request MAiD, and there's certainly no exclusion in the current law of people who are suffering from a mental disorder. They were basically not eligible because they weren't terminally ill, and since that's thrown out, anyone can request MAiD. So people who are feeling suicidal can request MAiD instead, and there's no reason you can refuse such a request if they seem to meet the criteria, even if the person was doing fine, stopped taking their medication, got terribly depressed, and the doctor felt, well, why don't you try your medication for another month and maybe you won't want to end your life. That's not permitted according to the current criteria. So I would hope that in developing laws to regulate access to MAiD, which is something which Trudeau said he has the intention of doing based upon the recent Superior Court, decision, which doesn't look like it's going to be contested to the Supreme Court. You should look at how you're going to protect vulnerable people. Ambivalence is often there. The research goes back 50 years showing that people who are dying, on the one hand, maybe like reasonably talk about the fact that they're dying, they understand it. And at the same time, you be looking at magazines for vacations next year and enjoying the ability to do that. People do change their minds. And for that reason, and I think I might be jumping ahead to another slide, but when both assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal, which is the case in Canada. I know a lot of people don't like the word euthanasia or assisted suicide. We like to call it medical assistance in dying because it seems less deathly. Euthanasia, you're ending someone's life. But MAiD, that's medical assistance. A doctor is helping you to die. It seems, much nicer, but what we're talking about is doctors ending people's lives and assisted suicide providing the means. But in the case of assisted suicide, you are in control. You have much more autonomy. You've got the medicine there, and you can take it or not take it. And over a third, 36% in Oregon decide, well, maybe it's not so bad. I'll keep it in case I need it. And they never need it. But in the case of the practice of euthanasia, when a doctor comes, which is the main practice in Canada, the doctor makes an appointment, the family comes, they ask you, do you want to go ahead with this? But it's a social pressure. It's an event that's been planned. It's not so easy to say to the doctor, well, maybe I'll wait till tomorrow. I can live another day. And then tomorrow say, well, maybe next week. People don't do that. They just go along with it as planned. So if you really want to respect autonomy, you should consider that assisted suicide allows this more easily. And in conclusion, I'm going to read one of the concluding paragraphs for an article I wrote to deprive people who meet the criteria for MAiD of the opportunity to receive suicide prevention interventions by putting them in a category apart has no empirical or clinically reliable justification. I challenge you to find any hard data on that. Providing help to all without discrimination is not incompatible with respect for autonomous decision-making. I can provide help, but still respect your right to do what you please. Offering suicide prevention interventions to all provides an opportunity for some people who otherwise would have died prematurely to regain the will to live regardless of their circumstances. And I've seen this happen. So I'm going to stop here. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, you should type it in the little chat box and send it off. And Luc Dargis, our librarian, will tell me what's come in, and I will repeat it in case you don't hear him and do my best to respond. Do we have some questions or comments? An article and some references. Yeah, the PowerPoint will be available for anyone to see online at the CRISE.ca website in a couple of weeks.
First question, can MAiD achieve conscious death?
Conscious death. I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean by conscious death. I can't really respond to that. If you want to clarify that, I'll try to react to that question.
It means dying process. happening mindfully.
Mindfully. Well, I mean, you know, what is dying mindfully? Dying mindfully has some sort of consciousness of what is going on and the context and how you're feeling about it and your interactions with other people and how it is. And, you know, people who work in palliative care and hospice situations say that one of their goals is to develop that sort of dying. Now, the question is, if you determine the timing of your death and, you know, orchestrate that in some way, is that more mindful than being mindful of a natural process? I don't have the experience, and we don't have people who've gone through it and come back and told us about that. So I think that's, you know, that's a personal belief, and I don't have any comment on it. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, I guess we'll end here. And if you want to receive more information about our research center's activities, we have a information letter that is sent out every month. Go visit our website. Thank you very much.